Hi, this is Nicole from Birth Story Medicine. I wanted to talk about some seeds of birth trauma. So in our group, I did a little bit of an introduction about this a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to come back and start talking a little bit more about each seed. So this might be interesting for you if you're someone who's experienced upset or feeling unresolved or traumatized after giving birth yourself. And it may also be interesting if you're a birth worker, just to understand where some of the seeds of birth trauma can come from. The first birth story seed is exactly that. It's called the first birth story seed. So this is something that usually is planted back in childhood. So all the seeds that can potentially grow into birth trauma are often planted anywhere from like weeks, months, years before we even give birth. And they can all influence how we feel after birth and the meaning that we give to what's happened to us. So the first birth story it's like one of those first one or two highly charged emotional stories or explanations that we hear about birth. So before this point, like particularly when we're younger, maybe as a toddler and a preschooler, it never really occurs to us that humans are even born. We don't really think about people being pregnant or giving birth and understand that the way that we all get here is by someone, giving birth to us. But when we hear these first one or two birth stories, it'll click and fall into place. And we're sort of like, oh, wow, my mum was pregnant with me and my mum gave birth to me. And we realise that humans are born and have to go through a birth process to get here. So the first birth story it's something that we'll hear that evokes a bit of an emotional response. It'll make us sort of stop and think, oh, okay, well, that's how it happens. But you've got to remember that the first birth story, you're hearing it as a 6 or 7 year old. So sometimes you won't really be understanding the actual story because, as we know, children sometimes will just take bits and pieces and then put together their own version of it. I mean, we all do that. But particularly as kids, when you don't understand maybe the context, you might hear one piece of a story and then that becomes your first birth story. So what tends to happen is whatever our first birth story is, we will tend to make up really black and white rules about it. Now, again, you're a 6 or 7 year old when you're making up these ideas. So they'll be very black and white. So often if you've heard something about birth, you might come to a conclusion of, oh, I'm never going to do that, or I'm never going to let that happen to me. Or it could be something like, oh, I'm going to do that too. That's how my birth's going to go. So the first birth story seed in particular, it's going to be sitting there, subconsciously, often influencing what we'll be attracted to. Often we're looking for things that will confirm what we feel about birth. So often there'll be, we'll be looking to have our ideas about birth confirmed. So this might influence the kind of birth preparation we choose down the track or what type of model of care we go for. It can influence us in lots of different ways without our awareness because they're like just subconscious things we've been carrying around since, 6 or 7. And also whatever those black and white rules are can influence how we feel after we've given birth. So some examples of where your first birth story might come from. It could be just overhearing an account about birth, like you might hear one of your parents on the phone talking to someone about, this happened and then that happened, and you might only hear sort of like a piece of the conversation and that becomes your first birth story. You could witness something on television, and as you would know that often when you see birth depicted on television, it's often quite dramatic and there's like an emergency sort of aspect to it. It could be someone telling you something about your own birth story, like when you were born, or maybe you remember something about when a sibling was born and overhearing that. It could be like a story in a book. It could be anything, like any number of things, but it'll be like just that first time when you click that, oh, humans are born. So exploring the first birth story is something that I've done a lot in childbirth preparation. And there's lots of different types of stories that people will recognise as their first birth story. So I'll give you some examples. I had one client who her first birth story was her mum telling her about when she was born, and her mum had been basically playing tennis through the early stages of labour, and then pretty much as soon as she'd finished her tennis game and went to the hospital, the baby was born like not long after. So if you were to imagine being a 6 or 7 year old and hearing that story, what kind of rules or beliefs do you think that you might have about birth? And you can pause this if you like to think about it. So someone who has a first birth story like this, they could have some similar ideas to say, birth is easy, it's quick, it's no big deal, it's not a fuss at all, like just get on and do it. So you can imagine then when they come to give birth themselves, if their birth happens to be the same, what do you think that they would take from that? See, I was right. Yep, cool, birth is easy. Then if by chance they'd had a very different experience of birth, like lots of interventions or complications, or it unfolded much more slowly, what sort of ideas or how do you think that might affect them after they've given birth? Like they might think, well, hang on, maybe my body doesn't work like it's supposed to. They can even feel betrayed by their own first birth story, not even consciously, because they might not even be aware of it all the time. So sometimes we're matching up this first birth story subconsciously against what actually ends up happening to us in birth. So you could see how this could be like a seed for feeling upset, disappointed, betrayed, confused, and even traumatized. Or then you could have someone who had a completely opposite type of story where maybe there was a story where their mum lost a lot of blood after giving birth to them and it was really touch and go. Maybe their dad has said to them, oh, we thought we were going to lose her. You could imagine that there'd be quite different rules and beliefs made up about birth if you had that as your first birth story. So it could be things like, birth is dangerous, blood loss is dangerous, which obviously it can be. I nearly killed my mum. So you can imagine how having those beliefs could influence you quite differently, even as you prepare for birth. And then also when you're trying to process your own birth experience later. So I thought that I would share my first birth story because it's actually been quite influential in lots of other areas of my life as well as birth, which was an interesting surprise when I worked out what it was. My first birth story was hearing about my own birth. And I think I was a little bit older than 6 or 7. I think I was maybe closer to 10. And I remember my mum telling me that she had known exactly when she conceived because there was only one time it could have been. But the whole time she was pregnant, they kept telling her that she was due a lot earlier than what she was, like even a couple of weeks earlier. And this was back in the day pre-ultrasound, so there was no dating ultrasounds or anything to confirm the dates. So when it came closer to my due date, I think they tried to induce her a couple of times and it wasn't successful. And finally, she said around the time when I was actually due to come, it finally worked and she went into labour. And I remember her saying, see, I knew my body. Those doctors didn't know anything. Now, what sort of rules or ideas or beliefs do you think that I might have made up about a story like this? Well, I'll tell you. I made up beliefs that, doctors are stupid, women know better, than doctors. Women know their bodies, and, you know, women should just trust their bodies because they know more. So I wonder if you've got any thoughts about how this could have influenced me on my preparation to having babies, and also how it may have prepared me, you know, for when things went skew-if, which they did with my first birth. So I'll come back and speak about that a little bit more. But if you want to have a guess at maybe like what kind of models, like model of care that I would have chosen, what kind of beliefs, you know, other beliefs I could have had and how this could have influenced me, whether things went positively or negatively, share your thoughts. I'm going to come back and do some more videos about all the other birth story seeds as well. And I'll come back and follow up about this one as well. So share your thoughts.